All right, so the topic for the lecture is measuring public opinion. In the first part of chapter 9, talks about how your opinions are shaped and some of the techniques that are used to maybe convince you to support someone or to vote against somebody. Chapter 9, section 3 focuses on, okay, well, how do we actually measure public opinion, right? It's kind of a difficult thing to do. If I just ask you one-on-one what your opinion is, it's very easy to measure that. It's a lot harder when you think there's over 300 million people that live in the United States, right? Trying to get a sense of, well, what does the country believe? You can't go out and ask 320 million people what they all think. It's too hard. So we use what's called polls, where we ask a sample of people what they think, and then we say, okay, based on that, here's what we think the country believes. So we're going to be looking at a couple different areas and getting some key terms down. We're going to start off by discussing the development of the modern opinion poll. So taking a little bit of a look at the history of, well, like, where did these polls come from? Okay. Modern polling can really be traced back to the election of 1936 and a disagreement between Literary Digest, which was a popular magazine at the time, and this guy over here on the right, a guy by the name of George Gallup.
So there's an issue with them?
There's a disagreement between the two. And it had to do with who they thought was going to win the election of 1936. Literary Digest had correctly predicted the last 5 presidential elections. Using what was called a straw poll. So I'm going to give you a definition of a straw poll, because we need to understand what that is. A straw poll is an informal gathering of opinions, usually done by counting hands or some other simple method. Let's say that again. A straw poll is an informal method of gathering opinions, usually done by counting hands or some other simple method. Could be something like mailing something in or calling a number. Right? Think about like American Idol. You want to vote for Kelly Clarkson? Dial 1-800-793-KELLY. Right? Where nowadays a lot of straw polls are done online. Okay? It's not very formal at all. Anybody can do it. And so Literary Digest uses its straw poll, and they come out and say, we predict that a guy named Alf Landon is going to win the election. Alf Landon is going to beat Franklin Roosevelt. Alf, like Alf. You guys ever watch the show Alf? You guys even know what I'm talking about?
I do, but watch.
Oh my goodness. Alien life form. Alf,
Is it the guy
little
with the
alien
nose?
dude with the nose.
Oh, yeah.
Come on, you guys are killing me. Alf Landon. I said, Alf Landon's going to win. We're calling it. We've called the last 5 correct. We're going to be right again. Alf Landon is going to beat Franklin Roosevelt. George Gallup, on the other hand, disagreed. And George Gallup said, I've done a different poll, and I think Franklin Roosevelt's going to win. FDR. And he was so confident that his way of doing it was better that he publicly challenged newspapers to print the Literary Digest poll and his poll side by side. He said, look, I'm so convinced that I'm right. Why don't you put the two side by side? Print them, let everybody know that somebody disagrees with Literary Digest. Well, have any of you ever heard of President Alf Landon?
No.
Yeah, there's a reason. Because Franklin Roosevelt crushed Alf Landon in the 1936 election. So Gallup was right. Literary Digest was way wrong. So Literary Digest, what happened there? Ends up, so here's a newspaper that took up the challenge and printed. It said, well, hang on a minute. We have somebody who disagrees with Literary Digest, right? So everyone knew, okay, we've got these two separate groups that are calling the election. Literary Digest was woefully wrong. They end up pretty embarrassed about it as this came out after the election, saying, whoops, kind of messed that one up. We're embarrassed. And before long, Literary Digest, actually, their reputation was sort of shattered. And it wasn't long before they went bankrupt, went out of business. But the question is, well, what was it about Gallup? What did Gallup do that was so much better? What did Gallup do that was so much better? And the answer is that he used scientific sampling. Another important term we need to understand. Scientific sampling. So Literary Digest used a straw poll. They mailed out a whole bunch of ballots that said, okay, check here if you're going to vote for Roosevelt, check here if you're going to vote for Landon, and then mail it back to us. They got about 20% back. Okay, now they mailed out like 10 million ballots, okay, and they got like 2 million back. So they're like, we asked a whole ton of people. Here's the problem. What's going on in the United States in 1936?
War-ish.
The Great Depression. Okay? Yeah. Okay, we're in the middle of the Great Depression. Literary Digest got their mailing lists off of people who had telephones and automobiles. In the middle of the Great Depression, what kinds of people were going to be able to have telephones and own automobiles?
Which one?
Wealthier folks. Okay? So their results were unreliable. Right? They got a disproportionate number of Republican responses. They said, well, we got 2 million people who said, here's who I'm voting for, and a lot of them said Landon. I don't understand how we got it wrong. The problem was they oversampled the Republicans. Okay? What George Gallup did was he used scientific sampling. So scientific sampling means this. instead of asking anybody, you ask a smaller group of people that are more representative of the total population. Instead of asking just anyone, you ask a smaller group that better represents the whole population. So Literary Digest was oversampling the Republicans, right? They weren't getting a good sample of the population. Using scientific sampling, George Gallup was able to say, well, I'm gonna randomly ask people. So I'm gonna be getting Republicans saying who they're voting for, but I'm also going to be getting Democrats. I'm going to be getting some rich people, but I'm going to get some middle class people, and I'm going to get some poor people. I'm going to ask white people, I'm going to ask black people, I'm going to ask men, I'm going to ask women, right? So it was better representative of the whole population. And modern polls are still done using scientific sampling, okay? So almost 100 years later, polling is done the same way. George Gallup changed how opinion polls were done. He proved that you could scientifically figure out what people thought, right? What they believed. And obviously it still works reasonably well because we still use it today. So, that gives you a little bit of history there, a little bit of background. So let's talk about the next step here. How does the polling actually work? Right? I mean, we see polls in the news, right? So, 62% of the country disapproves of the way Congress is doing its job or disapproves of the president. You see those in the news a lot. So how does it actually work? How do they come up with those numbers? There are 4 steps. And I want you guys to not just put the little 1 or 2 word that's up here. You need to put that, but add a little bit more to your notes as well. Add a little bit more than just the basics. All right, step 1 is to survey. And what you have to do at this step is you have to figure out who are you going to include in your survey. Who are you going to include in your survey? Put another way, who are you going to be asking questions to? Are you going to be asking the whole population? Are you going to be asking only men or only women? Are you only interested in what Republicans think? Or are you only interested in what Democrats think? Are you going to, and this is one that comes up a lot, are you going to survey all eligible voters, or are you going to survey likely voters? So you've got to figure out who we're going to ask questions to. Step 2 is the sample step. And at this step, once you've figured out who you're going to be asking questions to, what group you're interested in, you randomly call people in that group. Randomly call people in that group. And most surveys are still done by telephone, though some are done by internet, but a lot of times it's still done by telephone. And you randomly call people in that group because by randomly calling, it ensures that you're going to get answers that reflect the whole population and not just one group. So let me give you a numerical example. Let's say you were interested in how people in the city of Richmond were going to vote for mayor, right? Are people in Richmond going to vote for the Republican candidate for mayor, or are they going to vote for the Democratic candidate for mayor? Okay? And let's say that the city is 70% Democrat and 30% Republican. If you randomly call people in the city of Richmond, there is a 70% chance you're going to get a Democrat on the line. And there's a 30% chance you're going to get a Republican. So by randomly calling, you're ensuring that the answers you get are reflecting the whole population. Okay? If I only called people who lived out in the West End, I'm probably going to get more Republicans. That tends to be kind of a Republican area, right? And my answers would be all off. So I need to randomly call people that are inside of that group. Has to be random, okay? Step 3, you're going to sum up your findings. Which means you're going to take all the information you got and you're going to put it into a report. And the last step, probably the most confusing, and I'm going to try to just keep it really simple, is you have to include a margin of error. You have to include a margin of error. And a margin of error is, simply put, a number that tells you how accurate the survey is. It's a number that tells you how accurate the survey is. The smaller the number, the more accurate the survey. So on an opinion poll, this is always expressed as a plus minus. Okay? So you will see, it'll say, okay, margin of error is plus or minus. Oftentimes, it's right around 3%. Plus or minus 3%, that's the margin of error. Simply means it could be off one way or the other by 3%. 3% is a pretty small number, right? So you want it to be small. If it starts getting up to 7, 8, 9, 10%, it's not a very accurate survey. It's not very reliable. It needs to be a small number, typically around 3%, maybe 4%. If it starts getting above that, you should question the survey. So let's think about what that means. Let's say there is a poll that comes out that says, okay, we've done a survey of whether people will vote for Mitt Romney or Barack Obama. Okay, 2012 candidates. And we had 48% of the people we surveyed said they're going to support Mitt Romney. 50% said they're going to support Barack Obama. First thing you'll probably notice is that that doesn't equal 100%. Okay? Because there's going to be people who aren't sure. There's undecideds. Okay? And if the margin of error is plus or minus 3%, what does that tell us about this race?
Too close to call.
It is too close to call. It says, well, what we found is that Barack Obama is likely ahead, but that does not mean he's definitely going to win. right? Because the plus or minus 3% means Mitt Romney is somewhere in the 45 to 51% range. And Barack Obama could be anywhere from 47 to 53%. So if their numbers are off and Obama ends up at 47 and Romney ends up at 51, Romney's going to win. Okay? So what it means is you have to take this into account. Now, if these numbers were different, if these numbers said Mitt Romney is at 30% and Barack Obama is at 68%, the margin of error isn't going to make any difference, right? Because the gap is just way too large, okay? But the margin of error, people don't understand. Like in the 2000 and 2004 elections, they said, well, wait a minute, the polls said John Kerry was going to win. John Kerry was ahead. How did Bush win? There's a conspiracy. No, there's not a conspiracy. People just didn't understand margin of error. What the polls meant was the race is too close to call. It could go either way. So you always need to look, when you look at a survey or a poll, look at the margin of error. So here's an example of an actual poll that came out in the 2012 presidential elections. This was right before one of the presidential debates. Is there anything Mitt Romney or Barack Obama could say or do during the upcoming presidential debates that would cause you to change your vote for president? Tells you, who did they survey? They asked people who identified themselves as either Obama voters or Romney voters. Tells us when they did it. It tells us there were 1,317 responses. And it tells us the margin of error, plus or minus 3%. So, and then it breaks it down. Here's the summing up of the findings. It said, okay, if you looked at all of the responses, only 15% of people said, yeah, depending on what's said in the debates, I might change my mind. 83% said, nope, not going to change my mind, no matter what. Okay? And then plus or minus 3%. So it could be as low as 12%, could be as high as 18%. Okay? But something like this, does it tell us exactly 100% accurate? No. It's not 100% accurate, but it does give us some useful information. Most people are already set. They're not going to change their minds. Barack Obama could come out and fall flat on his face, which in a lot of ways he did in the first debate. Okay, he did not do well. And still, about 80% of the people would say, yeah, it doesn't really matter. I'm still going to support who I'm going to support. Okay? But this plus or minus 3% is the margin of error. So we know that's a low number, it's a pretty accurate poll. Okay, so how is polling used? Get up. How is polling used? I think that was my first marker throw of the year. All right, two main reasons we're going to talk about here. Measuring public sentiment is the first one. And so polls aren't always done about politics, right? Sometimes you've got businesses that will use polling. And they'll do polling to learn about what consumers want. So, if you're Walmart, you're trying to figure out what do the people want? What do we need to be making and putting in the stores that people want? Do a poll. Conduct a poll and figure out what should we be making more of. The media will use polls to measure public opinions. And they'll just use polls to figure out what Americans think about certain issues. These are the ones that we probably see most often. Oh, leading off the news tonight, 72% of Americans think Congress stinks. 51% of Americans think that this should be done. 42% of Americans think that, right? They're getting those numbers from polls. And politicians will use polls to see how well they're doing or to see what issues they should be focusing on. The second way that polling can be used, we're going to talk about, is during campaigns themselves, which is what we've been seeing the last several months. Okay? And we're talking about three specific polls: a benchmark poll, a tracking poll, and an exit poll. Okay? A benchmark poll is a sort of before poll. It's done before a campaign to test the waters and see whether a candidate should run for office. A tracking poll is done during the campaign, typically every day or every other day, to measure how people's opinions are changing. And then the exit poll is the after the campaign poll, which is basically just to see how different groups voted, right? How did people vote? So political parties might look at exit polls and say, hey, we didn't get much support from women. Women voted for the other guy. Next time around, we need to change our message so that we can get more women to vote for us, for example. So three specific types of poll we need to know about there: benchmark, tracking, and exit. All right, our last topic, where did we go here? Our last topic is, how can polling be misused? Well, we're going to look at three different ones here that we need to understand what they are. Loaded questions, straw polls, and push polls. All right, a loaded question is a question that is worded in such a way that it tries to force you to give a certain answer. It is a question that is worded in such a way that it tries to force you into giving a certain answer. And I'll go over some examples in just a minute. You should already have a definition for straw polls. Right? We talked about that earlier, but those are often misused. And the big issue with straw polls is they're just unreliable. They're just very unreliable. Typically, it's just people who either really care about an issue or are really angry about an issue will vote multiple times and skew the results. Kind of think like American Idol, right? You've got the people that will vote 150 times for the person that they like. So they're not very reliable. And then the last is called a push poll. And a push poll is a poll taken close to election day. That tries to push someone away from supporting a candidate by asking biased questions or spreading damaging information. Taken close to election day, aims to push voters away from a candidate by asking biased questions or spreading damaging information. So a quick example of a push poll, right? It's close to election day. I call up, I randomly call somebody, okay? Or it may not even be random because push polls are not scientific polls. And AJ answers. AJ, hi, I'm conducting a poll, blah, blah, blah. I want to make it sound like it's a real legit poll. Can you tell me, will you be supporting Mark Warner or Ed Gillespie in the coming election? Pick one.
Ed Gillespie.
Oh, okay, so you're going to support Ed Gillespie. Tell me, would you still support Ed Gillespie if you knew that he wants to take away Social Security for Virginia seniors? Well, I mean, no. I didn't know he wanted to do that, right? May or may not even be true. The idea is I want to give him some doubt. I want to push him away. And it's a very unethical tactic. It's a very, very unethical tactic. Okay? All right, so let me real quick, last thing we'll do is look at some examples here of some loaded questions. Here's an obvious loaded question. Barack Obama supports a government effort to take away your Second Amendment rights. Do you support this infringement on your constitutional freedoms? No. No, I don't want people taking away my freedoms. Of course not. I don't support that. It's a loaded question. It's designed to push you into giving a certain answer. Okay? Now that one's obvious. Here's one that's not so obvious. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Any able-bodied person can find a job and make ends meet. Doesn't seem loaded. Doesn't seem loaded. When this question was asked, 65% of people said, yeah, I agree with that statement. Let me show you real quick why it's loaded. Here's the same question asked a little bit differently. Some people feel that any able-bodied person can find a job and make ends meet. Others feel there are times when it's hard to get along, and some able-bodied people aren't able to find work. Whom do you agree with more? So instead of just showing one side, it showed both sides. And when this question was asked this way, only 43% of people said any able-bodied person should be able to find work. Okay? So loaded questions sometimes aren't so obvious, but they're important for you to take into account anytime you're looking at a poll. Okay. That does it for today's lecture.